I'll ask Julia to start by just saying a little bit about what is it that led you to decide to give away a substantial part of your income. Alexander, so we'll just say
hi there.
Great, it's great that you're with us. So I was just introducing our other guests. I think you can't see them, right? But we've got Julia Wise and Zell Kravinsky here, and I'm going to ask them to just say a few words about what led them to the decisions that they've made about giving, and then I'm going to come to you, okay?
Yep, sounds great.
Good. All right, so Julia, let's start with you.
I guess since the time that I was a child, it seemed that I had everything I needed and more. I grew up in a pretty middle-class family, went to college, got a white-collar job, and I really never lacked for anything that I needed. And it's always been very striking to me that there are so many people who lack the basics. So I've always wanted to do something about that. And when I met my husband in college, he sort of thought, he hadn't really actually thought about it much at all, but sort of talked him into joining me in kind of keeping our needs small, basically. We looked at the type of lifestyles that we had grown up with as sort of middle-class kids, and we didn't find that we needed a lot of the stuff that we'd had. So when you're in college, you're sort of living in a small space, and you don't have a lot of material things anyway, and a lot of your enjoyment comes from friendships and people you enjoy being with. And so we've really kept the focus on that rather than on getting the the cars and the big houses and things like that. So just by keeping our needs small, I think from the time that we were first thinking about this, it's really been a smooth ride for us. Whereas it might have been harder if we had sort of had our parents' lifestyle and then decided to cut back.
Okay, thanks very much. Zell?
I don't know. To me, it always seemed axiomatic that you would give away what you didn't need. I don't know why, precisely, but it strikes me as, the other philosophy strikes me as bizarre, to believe that things that have come your way by happenstance, by the accidents of birth and time, should continue with you and not be distributed to people that need you. I don't know why we accept that as the way. I was raised, my father and my grandfather said, from each according to their ability, to each according to their need. That was the Marxist formula. But it seemed to me growing up that all the systems that gauge the extent of your contribution are debatable and self-interested and questionable and get you into trouble. So I just went with to each according to their need, because at the fringes of need, it's easy to see that somebody who has a lot less than you needs a great deal of what you have if you have a lot more than you need.
It's one thing to say that, though, Zell, and a lot of people do say something like that, to each according to their need. It's another thing to do it, and I find, I'm not sure, you mentioned your father and grandfather saying that, but were they actually practicing it?
I guess to an extent my grandfather was, and my father felt that leftist politics, he was against private philanthropy because it blunted the edge of revolutionary fervor, he felt. But what I didn't understand about that, I wasn't sure in my mind if that was two discrete items on a wish list, from each according to their ability to each according to their need, or it was a social contract. Because a lot of people in America will say, well, I'm for that. A lot of rich people who don't give will say, well, that's fine, to each according to their needs, so long as they've given according to their ability. And the gauge of what they've given is their salary. If you make $100,000, you gave $100,000 to society. So they say that formula is fine with them.
Mm-hmm.
But it's, when you start to gauge,
right,
it's going to be one another horribly self-interested project. So it's so much simpler to go with need.
Okay. Let's come to you, Alexander. How did you get involved in this?
Probably the basic answer is through a class very similar to this one. I was taking an ethics class at Stanford and read some of your work and some of the stuff about Zell, and so sort of heard about kidney donation as something that people could do in that context. And at first, I remember thinking that it sounded a little bit crazy and just not something I identified with at all. And then over time, actually, I read like an undergraduate thesis that somebody had written that sort of mentioned as an aside just how safe it was to donate. And then, sort of following up on that and doing a little bit more research, and it also turns out that the benefits for recipients are really large, something like on the order of 10 more years of life. And so once I started thinking in those terms, I did sort of start to see Zell's perspective a little bit more and start to think of it as at really relatively low cost to myself, running a small personal risk, I could save somebody else's life in ways that seemed like really, really like a positive trade-off. And so, that's how I started thinking about donating a kidney. And then, I have some affinity for both Zell and Julia's other ethical decisions as well in terms of donating. And I came to work at GiveWell through some similar thinking.
Okay, so we read the article you wrote for the New York Times, which I think you wrote a day or two before you actually donated the kidney, right? That's how it starts off. So perhaps you ought to bring us up to date and tell us how it went.
Yeah, well, it went well. I'm safe and healthy, and so I donated to start a kidney chain. Often people want to donate to their spouse or a loved one, but they're not a match. And so what they do is they enter a chain so that it's easier to get a match. And so, I donated to somebody, a middle school math teacher in rural Pennsylvania, who then her husband donated on her behalf to sort of continue this chain, which ended up having 6 connections. And then, I think I said in my op-ed that it might be called relatively painless. And that perhaps was a slight overstatement. But overall, the operation is safe, and it wasn't too bad at all. And I'd happily do it again. And I took a couple of weeks off, sort of went home for Christmas, and then was back at work in the new year, and back to rock climbing a few weeks after that. So it hasn't affected my lifestyle or decisions at all, really. But I'm happy I did it, and I would happily do it again.
If you had another kidney to spare.
Yes, exactly.
Right. Have you had any contact? You mentioned you've identified the person, obviously, who received it. Have you had any contact with her?
Yeah, we've corresponded a little bit. I had a tough time deciding initially whether I wanted to sort of be known to her or know who she was, because, I entered the process sort of randomly. It wasn't like I picked my recipient. And so even though I felt really good about sort of the average effect of donating, there was this question for me about, when you're thinking about like the actual sort of embodied person that you're giving to, instead of like an abstract idea, like maybe it's somebody who you don't end up liking, or maybe they are the one in 100 or something where it doesn't work out or they get sick. And actually, I think the number is significantly higher than that. Maybe my kidney would fail for some reason, and she would get sick again the next year. And so I ultimately decided that given the decision and given who I was, I knew I would want to be able to thank the person who donated to me. And so that seemed to me to be like the right decision, was to, be in touch so that she could thank me if she wanted to, because I knew that would be important to me. But it wasn't an easy decision for me to make that call. Okay.
Zell, how about you? Have you had contact with the person you donated with?
Not for a while. Mm-hmm. And then, it's a little complicated with me because my wife still doesn't support the decision, and
right, I think that was...
Or have good feelings about the recipient.
Yes. Okay. Yeah, I think that's clear from the article that you have some tensions in your domestic life because of your ideas about what you ought to be doing, disagreeing with those of your wife.
But I'm wondering if Alexander had the same had somebody in his life who was strongly negative and changed their mind afterwards, because my friend Alan didn't want to talk to me about it, and afterwards, as you know, he became more enthusiastic about it.
Right. Mm-hmm. Alexander, was there someone in your life who was opposed to what you were doing, who's come around?
I was pretty lucky. My parents initially were unenthused, to say the least, but after a few months of sort of wearing them down and continuing forward with the process, and I think demonstrating that I was serious about it, they sort of came around and were ultimately supportive. I think they both wished I had delayed it indefinitely, But when push came to shove, they were there to sort of see me in the hospital and to help me through the process. And I really appreciated that. There was nobody in like sort of my personal life who was saying, "You're making such a huge mistake. Don't do this." I don't know if any of you guys read the comments on the Times op-ed. Like, there were like 190 people out of like 200 there saying, "You're making such a mistake. Don't do this." But I was lucky to be privileged in my personal life with a lot of sort of supportive, thoughtful friends who were happy to help in the process.
Okay, thanks. So Julia, as you said in your decision, you made that jointly with Jeff, who's now your husband, I guess wasn't at the time you were discussing it, is that right? So that would have made things a lot easier, but how about your parents and his parents? Did they think that you ought to be saving more for buying your own home or for having children in future or something of that sort?
My parents have certainly been more conservative about sort of financial decisions than I have, and I think there were, especially in the early years, some things I did that didn't exactly help that. I said that I wouldn't accept any Christmas presents one year, and if they gave me any, I'd sell them and give the money to charity. That didn't go over too well. I don't recommend doing that. It just upsets your grandmother. So once I learned to not do things that upset my grandmother, things were a lot smoother. And at this point, I think they're proud of me, and they see that I'm not living in a cardboard box, which I think was their fear, and that I have the things I need, and so I think they feel much more positive about it than they did, certainly.